Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Objective. Joining you from the road, and I'm joined by a guy who, well, if we needed get a co-host to discuss this topic with, he'd be the guy. It's former prosecuting attorney, James Valiant. Welcome to the show.
Hey, how you doing, Rucka?
A little bit all over the place, as you can tell by the intro, not the usual flawless introduction. So Elon Musk purchased Twitter, whatever that means. Like, he owns enough of it to act like it's his personal toy. And he's been sort of selling himself as like this champion of free speech, kind of a man of the people, letting people vote on who gets their banned accounts reinstated, stuff like that. And the most recent thing that's been taking place for about a week is that he's giving particular journalists access to some inner files of Twitter to sort of explain what's been going on the last few years. Is it a sort of political scandal or something like that? So have you been paying close attention to all of it? First, Matt Taibbi reported the first batch of stuff, and then Bari Weiss more recently.
Yeah. Elon Musk apparently trusts certain journalists and a couple of lawyers to leak this stuff out. It could be days of information. But the context here, of course, is the wider context of social media. As objectivists, we understand that only government can be the source of censorship. Only the threat of force can really constitute censorship. So in a free market, private companies have a right to take positions, take partisan positions. Newspapers and magazines in the United States have always done that, taken clear partisan positions. I mean, the Podunk Democrat or the Patuca Republican would even be the name of the publication, and they would routinely recommend candidates to vote for every election. So in print media, it was never a secret that the media had ideological bias. Now, for a time in the United States, under what clearly is a form of censorship, the Federal Communications Commission had a fairness doctrine that ran from the 1960s to the 1980s, which required that television news outlets have a certain balance, ideological balance. Now, of course, that's a mythological goal. There's no such thing as, quote, ideological balance. But the networks sort of complied. The three main networks by the 1970s were this main source of information for Americans. 85% of Americans got their news from these three television networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And they weren't reading newspapers anymore. And they did have an ideological bias. Many studies at the time showed that there was a slight left-leaning bias to all those networks. And they were under the guise of the FCC fairness doctrine. But of course, it was a left-leaning, biased, but it was much more objective, and objective standards of objective journalism were higher, so they sort of got away with it longer. But Ronald Reagan got rid of the fairness doctrine, and in the recent decades, you can see what that's done to television news journalism. We now have Fox and Newsmax, which are clearly and overtly conservative. We have MSNBC and CNN, which are clearly and overtly liberal. It takes the mask down, the fraud down. You can't present news without filtering it through your bias, through your values. Let's put it more objectively, because that is potential. What's an important news story? What do we cover? How do we cover? What do we cover first? What really constitutes news? All of that will be filtered through a set of values. So a truly, quote, unbiased news is impossible. Along come the 90s and the internet. And I don't mean to make a big history lecture here, but the government granted the social media platforms immunity from civil liability. They said, look, for us to do these posting boards, we can't be liable for what all these millions of people are posting. So you have to give a civil liability from their posts. And the Congress complied. The justification for that favor that they got from government, which exempts them from normal civil liability, was done on the premise that these were open social media platforms, that anyone could post anything, that Twitter was not filtering the posts that people were putting on, for example. And Twitter lied to everybody about what they were doing, as it turns out. Twitter was saying, Jack Dorsey testified under oath before Congress, we were not shadow banning conservatives. And in fact, there was communication between the Biden administration, presumably, we're waiting to hear all that, but clearly the Biden campaign was having communication saying, take this down, we don't like this. And Twitter was doing what handled is what that's the operative word when Twitter would respond to the Biden campaign. Don't worry, we handled that. And in the Hunter Biden laptop story, it became acutely clear. It was an easily verifiable story. It turns out to be totally true. And government officials from the Obama administration, especially national security people, said this is Russian disinformation. And the government was telling Twitter, beware of Russian disinformation. And although it was easily verifiable, Twitter went so far as to remove the oldest newspaper in the country, the New York Post, from posting at all, because they were posting what turned out to be a perfectly true story. And they were doing it clearly to influence a campaign at the behest of a campaign. And so is that a form of censorship? Since the government has the power to threaten with antitrust, if the government has the power to grant special favors like civil liability protections, haven't we now entered a realm of quasi-censorship? And even though, and this is where it gets complex, Twitter, through its own ideological bias, probably wanted to do this. They weren't being forced, in effect, to do this. But there was always that sort of Damocles hanging over their head, of government force. Republicans, as you pointed out before, were leading the charge on antitrust. Hey, let's nail these people with antitrust violations. As objectivists, obviously, regard that as utterly pernicious. Anytime the government has the power to grant favors or to make threats or to use government force against a media agency, it must be regarded as a kind of censorship. We must strip the government from any power to control, threaten, offer favors to all of these private social media outlets, or it opens up a case that this is being done via a kind of censorship. And that's the difference that I would draw here. Was Twitter operating because of threats and favors they could get from the government, or were they doing this because they wanted to? Well, once you've got those threats, the issue gets blurred, doesn't it? Once you've got that power that government has, it gets blurred. So I would say that, yeah, insofar as they continue to have the power that they did over television with the FCC, for example, which they loosened up on, now they still have that kind of power over the internet. That's a kind of censorship Ayn Rand herself identified during her lifetime. There really is, it's the deeper lesson here is there's no distinction between civil liberties and economic liberties. Insofar as the government can offer economic threats and benefits to private companies, if those companies are media outlets, that can be argued to be a form of censorship.
Okay. I agree, of course, that the ultimate solution is to divorce government from the economy and make it so politicians have no favors nor penalties to offer, any businessmen other than, enforcing contracts and settling disputes. And until we get there, anyone at any time could always point at any instance of lobbying, any campaign donation, any friendship between politicians and businessmen, any of it, and say, oh, look, I told you the whole system is rigged against us. Look, this guy donated to that politician, and now that politician is, subsidizing that industry or taxing that other industry. It's endless. It's like Game of Thrones on steroids, injected with more steroids to try and untangle the net of special favors and corruption. But it's corruption, but it's corruption within the context of the system that everybody's been voting for to keep going, because people want those favors. They want, and virtually everybody in the world today, in America, in the West, wants the government to do something to protect their job, to help the poor, to do something to bring jobs home, whatever it is. Okay, until we get there, like I said, you can always point at one instance of a favor or of something and say, oh, look, the whole system's corrupt. Now, in this case, I will say what people are doing here, and it sounds like I'm hearing you voice this point of view, is pointing at one instance of Twitter doing something and saying, look, Twitter is clearly a Democrat arm. But I would challenge that, and I would say, first of all, it's the campaign, it's the Biden campaign doing it while Trump is in the White House doing the same thing. So why do we point at the Biden request to remove pictures of Hunter Biden's penis and other undesirable posts? Like, why is that an instance of Twitter being a Democrat arm, whereas the Twitter is not seen as an arm of the Trump administration at that time?
Well, of course, Trump was banned permanently. So Twitter is not an arm of Trump. Trump was omitted forever, and he had to be granted back in. Although the Ayatollah and Putin, although the worst dictators in the world continue to have Twitter accounts, somehow the New York Post, leading journalists, private journalists, and Trump were completely banned. And so they did.
Eventually, he was.
I think it is really irrational and impossible to say that Twitter was not hardcore ideologically biased left. They suppressed code information. They suppressed that Stanford doctor from making a perfectly correct statement. These COVID lockdowns are going to hurt kids. And he was banned, just banned for telling what would be the truth. So, and you go over and over and over, there's no question conservatives were being shadow banned. And now the evidence is coming out, and that Jack Dorsey, under oath before Congress, lied when he said that they were not being shadow banned. Now, in my view, the only protection in that instance is a sort of commercial fraud that Twitter was engaged in on the consumers. They were claiming a kind of neutrality and lack of shadow banning, which they were actually in private doing, and doing at the behest of a political campaign in many instances. They were doing the government's bidding with respect to COVID. Now, to what extent is it censorship when a media outlet simply mocks the government's line, when the government has the power to give them favors and antitrust? It becomes a gray area. And so you have to really consider, at what point is it that the government threats are what's controlling and dictating what Twitter is doing? Generally speaking, I believe in freedom. Elon Musk buying Twitter is exactly the kind of solution. The lefties have still got Facebook. Let the right have Twitter. But let's be honest. Let's strip the mask away that these people don't have an ideological bias. That's the fraud. The fraud was like the fairness doctrine that somehow the 3 television networks back in the 70s were giving us fair and objective and balanced news. That's impossible. Private media outlets should strip away this notion that, let me put it this way, that distinction between a publisher and a media outlet is a bogus distinction. It never really existed. There were ideological filters, and there's always going to be ideological filters. And that is unavoidable. That fraud has to be removed from social media. We have to be able to label Twitter a conservative outlet insofar as Elon Musk is running it, and Facebook a liberal leftist outlet so long as Zuckerberg is running it. And that's the kind of competition which would clear the decks and allow for a truly private media to happen. We have to eliminate the power of government to threaten or reward through law media outlets. Otherwise, there's always going to be an argument that somehow it was those threats and favors that got them to behave the way they did. As I say, I think most of the folks at Twitter probably would have happily gone along with it. They didn't need the government threat. But once there is the government threat, how do you distinguih that?
I don't know if you need to distinguish that, but there's a number of things going on here. First of all, I'm saying, yeah, if Twitter has an ideological bent, then okay, they are entitled to that. I don't know if that means they need to be officially labeled as a left-leaning or right-leaning website or any of that. But we jumped over from we jumped over from the but we jumped over from the election over to COVID. But I will say the same way that the so-called fairness doctrine was always impossible, right? The law was, if you voice a quote liberal point of view, you need to also give an equal amount of time to the quote conservative point of view. I mean, those are floating titles anyway. It's stupid. So when did vaccinations become a quote leftist cause, right? So it's silly, and it's silly on, again, it's like Game of Thrones on steroids to try and untangle what's left and what's right, what's conservative, what's liberal. So in the same way that it was always impossible to give equal time to quote both sides, it would be equally as impossible to get to the bottom of, is Twitter actually acting on behalf of the left or on the right? It's easy to accuse them, but I think it would be, as you know, as an attorney, it would be very difficult to actually articulate. So having seen more or less the same evidence as you, I'm not convinced that what Twitter's been doing has been this, this concerted effort to act on behalf of the left or the Democrats, especially since, like I said, yes, Trump eventually was banned, but back leading up to the election, Trump was the actual president, and his administration were making requests and having them granted at times, presumably the same way as the Biden campaign. So the Biden campaign at the time were only a campaign; they were not yet the government. So how is there this black and white? Clear. How do we conclude so clearly that Twitter is acting on behalf of the Democrats?
Well, let me bring up this. The second point you made is actually a very interesting one. Is a political campaign able to do censorship like a government official is? And there, I think it's very interesting. If I'm trying to get Biden elected so that I can get the favor or avoid the problem that government can get down on me, then even a political campaign, in effect, can, in my view, look, if it was openly doing the bidding of a campaign, that would be one thing. If it was privately doing the bidding of a campaign, it would be another thing. And you're right, when Twitter was criticizing the government, Trump, it's a really good argument that they're not censoring at all. They're speaking truth to power, to use the cliche. But now what we're talking about is replacing Trump with an administration that would be more favorable to them. Now, getting back to your first point, I think it can easily be demonstrated that Twitter wasn't merely pro or anti-vax, for example. It was taking the CDC line as it was changing moment to moment and suppressing medical doctors who were saying, well, no, the effect on teenagers of the lockdown would be negative. Now, I happen to agree with that doctor. We now know that the effect of the lockdowns was horrific. And that truth was being suppressed by Twitter for purely ideological reasons. And I think that the bias can, once we get all the evidence, I mean, Dorsey said to Musk, release it all. And I agree with him, release it all. And when we release it all, then we can see whether they had this bias or not. Claiming to have no bias, in effect, or testifying we're not shadow banning conservatives when in fact they're shadow banning, or they're outright banning the whole New York Post, the oldest newspaper in the country, one of the top circulating newspapers in the country, altogether, for a story that was easily verifiably true at the time. I mean, at the time, I knew it was easily verified, and they were simply lying about it being Russian disinformation. That was apparent to me at the time. So I don't think it's credible to say that Twitter had any kind of, although look, if there is openness about it, doing the bidding of a campaign would be no problem. They'd be a private outlet. And if there were no government threats of force or favors, they could take a side and do the bidding of the campaign or the government. They have a right to ideological bias. It's that and whether they want to or not out of their own free will and willingness, I think once there is that government gun pointed at them is irrelevant. Now I don't care what your own personal decision is because it's affecting everybody. And
so, yeah, of course. So yes, we agree that the way out of this is capitalism, and so that there would be no question that whatever Twitter does, they're doing on their own accord.
Exactly.
I don't necessarily agree with the interpretation of events. So again, Joe Biden at the time was a candidate for president. Trump at the time was the president. So if Twitter acted on behalf of Biden, I guess this would speak to them being ideological or whatever, or being partisan, because
and in the hopes of getting special favors or avoiding threats from a new Biden administration.
Right. So it's hard to know.
Political campaigns can sometimes even be censorship, depending on the nature of the legal system.
Yeah, but I would still like in a lot of cases where people accuse, let's say, Twitter of being a voice of the government, a wing of the government. Whether we live in a free market or not, like I see it as like, okay, Twitter, they need to have a policy for this new situation, which is COVID in 2020. So they go, okay, whatever. We're just going to let the CDC, we're going to go to the official source, and Twitter are not the ones who created this division, this department of the government, the health, whatever, the CDC, they're not the ones who put the government in charge of sort of telling us what's going on. Obviously, if a board of doctors in the private sector were the ones sort of informing the public, I imagine Twitter would have turned to them for the official policy. But is it Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and others? They said, look, this is a very chaotic situation. We really don't want more people to be misinformed and as a consequence die than necessary. We're just going to enforce whatever the CDC says. So look, if the government says the sky is blue and then Twitter blocks or shadow bans anyone who says the sky is yellow, does that mean that like Twitter believes or doesn't believe? It's just like they're going with they said we're taking the government's advice in effect. So I don't see this as like an ideological thing, like left versus right, personally.
Oh, I absolutely do believe there was an ideological filter, because they were suppressing private opinions and saying they weren't. And they said they weren't just going by the CDC line. It's their lie. It's the lie that we weren't shadow banning. A perfectly reasonable Stanford medical doctor who was saying that it was going to hurt young people if we do these lockdowns. So we're suppressing private information and only giving government information. Now, I would not myself trust such a media outlet that only gave the CDC line. There, of course, should be no CDC. But insofar as the Twitter is taking only the CDC line, suppressing all other private opinions and saying, no, we're a free speech platform and we're all about information. No, they're not all about information. They're not all about that. Now, as I say, if there weren't those government threats and favors that could be offered, there'd be no question here. Then they could take the government line and say, hey, and why wouldn't they come out and honestly say, no, we're going to take the official CDC stance and we are, guess what, folks, if you have a different opinion, we're going to suppress it outright.
You don't think they said that?
They didn't say what they were doing.
Facebook,
they didn't say what they were doing. They were saying the truth.
Hold on. I know you said that Jack Dorsey told Congress we're not shadow banning conservatives, but do you see them suppressing the doctor vis-a-vis teenagers on lockdown as a as a conservative or liberal thing? Because to me, again, like COVID,
yes,
I don't necessarily
a partisan political issue.
I don't necessarily agree.
As such, no, the lockdowns
when they first came around. When they first came around, it was under Trump, and it was nationwide, and it was almost worldwide. So why is that
still a partisan issue? Now in March of 2020, I was saying, in March of 2020 on podcasts, I was predicting the disaster that we now know occurred from the lockdowns. There were lots of voices on the right. There were lots of voices politically who were saying that the lockdowns would be a disaster. Those voices were suppressed. And those voices were suppressed intentionally. And Trump himself the fact that Trump and Democrats agree does not make it a nonpartisan issue. No, indeed, Trump and the Democrats were both wrong initially about the lockdown. And at the time, they were suppressing it in their case, in part on behalf of Trump. Now, was it a partisan issue? Yeah. The lockdowns were a total partisan power grab. At the time, figures like Jane Fonda were saying COVID is God's gift to the left. And that's a direct quote. So that was early in 2020. And our 2 weeks to flatten the curve became, of course, months and then years and then on and on. No, definitely a partisan issue, even if you're a small minority. And that's the other thing. If it's just conservative versus a Democrat, we say, that it can't be a partisan issue. No, there's all kinds of other opinions out there and all kinds of other opinions that were being suppressed. In this case, the correct opinion that the lockdowns would be more deadly than help, as it turns out to be true.
Okay, so on YouTube, they banned a big channel that had nothing to do with politics. Some young, maybe teenage or early 20s entertainer had their entire channel removed from what I recall because there was a video circulating of them at a big party during the COVID situation. So that, like YouTube, they were saying, like they were really trying to be hands-on in discouraging people or encouraging social distancing. I still. Maybe you're able to analyze the situation and say this was coming from the left. Did they ban Governor Newsom for breaking those rules? Did they ban the mayor of Chicago for breaking those rules? Did they ban Nancy Pelosi for breaking the lockdown rules? No,
No,
but they did.
which clearly
No, hold on.
indicates they had a partisan bias.
But they did ban some entertainer that had nothing to do with politics for not socially distancing. So, like, they were not.
So they were being
Okay,
selective about who they banned, who were violating those rules.
but the
And it's
person
an
they were banning was
ideological
not.
filter, it seems to me.
But the person they banned was not a conservative. It was probably a Democrat. They were banning somebody for going for videotaping themselves at a big party, or for being seen at a big party or surrounded by people, not following the CDC request or suggestion, whatever it was, to socially distance.
The
So
leftist politicians were all left on the hook on that same issue.
I agree, but why is it a partisan thing for the social media to do what they could to get people to be socially distant, when, like, again, they banned like a YouTuber for going to a party? It wasn't about
the entire hysteria over COVID is what was behind the lockdown, and so many people agreeing with the lockdown. They were throwing logs on that hysteria, and on the other hand, suppressing any similar hypocrisy on the part of the left-wing politicians who were doing it. No, I think to say that the Hunter laptop situation is clear. It was totally partisan. They were doing it in order to affect the election. It was true information. They could have easily I could easily verify it at the time, and they were suppressing the truth to affect the election in a partisan way. I think that it would be really hard to argue that that wasn't the case with the Hunter Biden laptop story. That was totally partisan. And they were acting in behalf of one campaign, one political side over the other, in an attempt to get them into power. And those guys in power had a power to give them favors or threaten them. And
why is the Hunter Biden story a clear case of Twitter being partisan, whereas them getting similar requests from the Trump administration or other Republicans, that's not
they
proof
do anything
of Twitter
like that on behalf of Trump?
Yeah, that's what the
what did they do for Trump's campaign?
I don't know the exact thing they did. I don't know the exact thing they did, but there are countless requests that people at Twitter were getting. This is what the Tabibi summary indicates.
Newspapers get such requests all the time. And as I say, if there was no threat of government force, those requests wouldn't care if a Democrat or a Republican politician said, please don't run that story. They can make such requests, and it's up to the publication not to. But this distinction between neutral media platforms and partisan publications with an editorial policy is a lie, is just a lie. And special government grants of immunity have been granted social media based on that lie. Insofar as they have any partisan filter, which of course they do, that is a lie. And
there's a number of different things we're discussing at once. I still don't understand why Twitter acting on behalf of Biden's campaign is proof of them being partisan, whereas them doing the same thing for Republicans is not proof. Because
I want some examples of this, and I want to compare the numbers. If, for example, someone said, if Donald Trump said, look, they were lying to me and it was a lie, and they said, okay, you're right, Mr. Trump, we'll take down the lie. It was a clear lie. If the Democrats say take down the Hunter Biden story, which is nothing like a clear lie, then there's a clear bias. We have to look at those instances. And I say, it wouldn't matter if they were truly private. It wouldn't matter if they were taking requests from the government or different parties, if they were truly free of government threats and favors, but they are not.
Would you still accuse them of fraud, even if we were living in a free market? Would you say Twitter, they told us? Because I would not. Because here's why I would not. Again, the fairness doctrine was impossible to follow from the start, and it would be impossible for Twitter to be a completely nonpartisan, organization, because so many of these issues are fluid. You can't. You got anti-concepts left and right, like we're walking through a minefield. There's so much incoherence, and even differentiating all these different issues or different people's opinions. One guy's called a conservative, even though half of what he believes might actually be what you would have called leftist positions 10 years ago or even today. It's like, it's impossible. It would be impossible for Twitter to be nonpartisan if they wanted to. So that's one point I want to raise. And another is everyone curates content. Almost every website where the public is able to post curates content in some way. I think an exception would be BitChute.com, which if you go to BitChute.com, it's just like Jew bashing, Holocaust denying, aliens and conspiracies at like the top trending and homepage stuff, because they're completely hands off. But any other website you go to where a popular website where the public are able to post, you see curation in one way or the other. So such as like rumble.com, which is the big alternative video website, they definitely curate in favor of right-wingers.
Right. Now, if you lie about that is something. If I were to sell you a product, any product, an automobile, and I said this automobile turns both left and right with equal ease, and you get into your car and the car, no, it's not really turning right the same way it's turning left, you have been a victim of fraud, commercial fraud. You've been sold a product on a false pretense, and that is fraud. If Jack Dorsey testifies before Congress, we are not shadow banning on ideological grounds, and there's a demonstrable ideological component to it, then Jack Dorsey has committed perjury before Congress. And more than that, it appears that he's knocking on the door of having committed commercial fraud on his customers. You don't need antitrust, you don't need anything else. If someone is lying to you about the product that they're selling, they're engaged in commercial fraud. Now, and on the free market would still have that as a potential. If the New York Times, however, had no threats or favors, as newspapers generally don't in this country, then it would be impossible for me to make that kind of argument. It's your interpretation of what's liberal and your interpretation of what's conservative. But insofar as the government does have this power to just shut you down through antitrust prosecution or to give you special immunities from civil lawsuits, then it's impossible to disentangle that relationship, in my view. Once the government gun comes out, we have now entered the realm of quasi-censorship. At least we've entered the borderline realm in which one can argue that it's censorship. The threats and the power of government over these media outlets, a purely economic thing, which constitutes, and that's the thing, you can't separate civil liberties and economic liberties. They are one. They are one. And insofar as the government has economic power over these agencies, I regard the favors, for example, the special immunity deals that social media platforms get as something like the FCC, the previous FCC censorship doctrine. You see, it's a kind of government pressure and force, and only this time with a carrot rather than the stick. But I don't distinguish the two. A carrot from the government is a stick against their competitors. And that's the only way I think of looking at it. Now, I think the correct solution is something like let a private actor like Elon Musk buy Twitter, let him have a whole new editorial policy. But guess what? It's an editorial policy from a publisher. Let's stop the pretense of calling these social media platforms something other than ideologically motivated publishers, which is precisely what they've proven to be.
Again, I would really pick apart and nitpick a lot of the examples or the cases that are alleged to show that Twitter is a leftist platform. Again, it's a very complex thing. And if you had to basically prove this, you would have to really understand what's going on behind the scenes. There's so much that goes on in social media. And this goes back to, I think, when we had an episode about John Stossel suing Facebook. I was saying, look, we don't know if Facebook big top execs looked at John Stossel and said, let's lie about him, or if some guy in India who was hired to do some of the busy work labeled a post erroneously. These companies have so many posts happening every second of the day that they need to, in some way, keep tabs on it. The story
was known to one and all. We had all of the major national security officials from the Obama administration saying this is Russian disinformation. It was not Russian disinformation. Those partisans who had worked for the government officials, mind you, who had worked for the Obama administration were outright lying. They knew they were outright lying. It was not Russian disinformation. On the face of it, it could be verified. It was right before a campaign. They knew it was disastrous politically. It is impossible for me to not see the suppression of the Hunter Biden story as being ideologically motivated. A similar story against Trump would have obviously have been reported. I did not vote for Trump. I opposed Trump. I can never vote for Trump. You know, I'm anti-Trump. On the other hand, the idea that this was not a clear case of Biden, anti-Biden information, which people knew they could verify at the time, being suppressed for political reasons, is straining all credibility in my mind. That is a clear-cut case.
Look, I haven't seen the detail that that you've seen of that Obama's team members were putting pressure on
Brennan, you name all the national security officials. They signed a whole letter. They could have contacted them. If the former national security advisor for the previous administration says this looks like Russian disinformation to me, Twitter, what's Twitter going to do?
Right. So that to me is the much bigger story than Twitter. To me, Obama's friends or colleagues doing that, to me, is a much bigger scandal.
I agree. That is the bigger story. And the bigger story here is the power that government has to offer threats and favors to these private companies. That's the real issue. And that's where we need to focus the issue, is on the government's power over these media companies, just as economic entities, which can influence their ideological output. So it's not the communist model of censorship. It's more like the fascist model of censorship that we're in danger of entering into. The FCC's fairness doctrine clearly was a part of that. Are these favors and threats that they're giving social media companies part of that? I would argue yes. Now, is it a step less pernicious? Yeah. But is it pernicious? Is it a form of government threats and favors and force? Yeah, we've entered that realm. And once you enter that realm, you're now in that mixed area. Why is Twitter doing what it's doing? And once there becomes that question, it seems to me we have to lean on the side that it's the government, since it has that power, that's always in the background of Twitter's decision-making process. Would they have preferred the Biden administration to come in? It's clear, in my mind, Twitter wanted the Biden. They banned the whole New York Post. The entire newspaper was banned from Twitter because of that one story. Now, the oldest newspaper in the United States was banned from Twitter for one story that turned out to be absolutely true, by the way.
Okay, but the New York Post is also, from my understanding, a little bit of a trashy publication. So they're maybe known to stretch the truth a little bit. So maybe Twitter, they didn't want to give the New York Post the opportunity to,
the New York
spread
Times
what they thought.
A trashy publication these days. They used to have a much better reputation. But in my mind, still the premier role that they play in controlling news in this country is outsized. But that's up to private companies to be influenced by.
I agree. New York Times and other, sort of legacy media publications are like, they have the pretense of being like distinguished and respectable, but they've been lying for so much that it gives definitely it gives credibility to the rabble rousers of the reactionary right to say, yeah, let's just throw the whole thing away. But I say, whoa, careful, guys.
Wrong. Free speech includes the power to lie.
Well, not only that,
but includes the power to offend, but the power to lie. So if they weren't under this government threat, if there weren't government officials communicating with them with this implicit threat behind them, there'd be no issue in my mind. They could have outright lied about the Hunter laptop story for all I care, had there been no government threats, government power over them, and government present and potentially future government officials telling them what to do. Those combinations now create a situation where we all have to worry, at least, about how the government might influence social media companies. And the only fair response is to get the government the hell out of that business. Say, we're never going to prosecute you for antitrust. Better yet, repeal the antitrust laws. We're never going to grant special favors because you're a media company, a special kind of platform versus publisher. That distinction never made any sense to me. They're all publishers. They all have value filters. We acknowledge that. Get rid of this immunity that social media companies have. I've always been opposed to.
Really?
Opposed to. Yeah.
So hold on. So I tweet something you don't like, you can sue Twitter? Is that what would result in that?
Insofar as Twitter is filtering your posts, insofar as Twitter takes responsibility for your posts, no, we're responsible for your posts because we'll ban your posts if we don't like them. Yeah. Now
But there's
they
like a
are
trillion
responsible.
posts per minute, though. Like, and there's like a trillion posts per minute. How's Twitter gonna be responsible for everything that everyone's posting? They need immunity in order to exist as a publicly like a
I
paper.
disagree. I
No,
disagree.
all right.
Newspapers don't. Television networks don't need immunity, do they? No, they don't
Well,
even.
to get on TV, you got to really get greenlit. But for you and me to go online and post something takes 5 minutes.
Right. Now, if they're going to have ideological filters, ban people altogether because of some post that they have, now they've entered the job of filtering people's posts. Insofar as they ideologically filter people's posts, they are a publisher and have a responsibility. I don't care how many people are submitting. They are now entering that realm of doing the filter. Now, if they want to be honest and they say, okay, we're really letting everyone say anything they want, except for, say, violence and crime, then that would be one thing. But they don't.
I like, okay, so what if a bookstore chooses to carry certain books and not to carry other books? Does that mean that bookstore is now responsible for everything that contained in all those books? So if there's a lie, a slanderous sentence in that one of those books, you can sue the bookstore?
No. But if the book, that's the exact distinction I'm drawing here between newspapers, bookstores, and these social media companies that are now under the threat of antitrust prosecutions from Republicans and have been granted special immunity favors from the government. And the threat of taking them away, yes, will have a big impact on them. But that's the whole thing. If they were acting neutrally, if they could say, well, we didn't have control over what that person posted, that would be one thing. But they do. And they're using that. And they're using it with an editorial policy. That makes them publishers. I don't care how many letters to the editor. Look, imagine a newspaper said, we'll publish 1,000 letters to the editor. And you can't blame us because we're publishing 1,000 letters to the editor. If they're still ideologically filtering them, they're still ideologically filtering them, as they would. And as we would say that about any publication.
So again, I don't think it would even be possible, even if Twitter wanted to be completely hands off, in order for them not to be a hateful, conspiracy, pornographic website within a moment or a day. They need to curate content. They need to have some kind of editorial curation that they're doing, and there would be no way around that. So I don't see how that makes them now liable for what everyone's posting, if I understand.
Well, it
Correct.
depends on the nature of the liability. I would break down. Why should they be less liable if they are filtering, would be the question. Now, if they could come into court and say, well, we don't do that, then of course, then they would have a good defense against the libel suit. Look, we didn't review this for a libel. We're not in charge of this. This was their post. That would be a good defense. They'd be able to defend against that liability suit by saying, look, we didn't. Look, this was just one of a million posts and we didn't. And look at our editorial policy. But they have to regard this as an editorial policy. And they would be judged based upon the nature of their editorial policy. If a newspaper published a letter to the editor, which implicitly had some kind of slander in it that the newspaper didn't know, they would have a defense against that, just as a social media company would. But that would be the same legal defense and basis in my mind, and should be.
Okay, so there's a number of sort of things we've covered here today. One is like, what would it look like for Twitter to operate in a free market? I maintain it would not be that different from what it is today. And if Twitter is going to exist at all, it needs basically the same legal protections as it has today, or they would just simply close shop, or they would just change completely. And they're going to change completely. That's kind of my perspective I've been voicing this whole time. Once Elon Musk buys Twitter, it's not really Twitter anymore. It's not organic. It doesn't feel like the same Twitter it was. It's like become this project. It's not the same website that people flocked to in the late 2000s because it was this interesting new website. Now it's like everything's being politicized. I will say this, we both hate Trump, but we can recognize some of the brilliance of his methods, I guess, or even if his so-called brilliance was just him drifting into a vacuum left open by a decaying culture. But Trump, he saw the leftist handbook that said everyone I don't like is Hitler, and Trump said everyone who doesn't like me is the left.
Right.
Even if he never uttered those exact words, that's how his defenders.
Trump was the pioneer of using tweets among politicians. He aggressively used tweets as a form of announcing policy when he was president. He was using Twitter as a platform and using them. And his getting banned, obviously, is ideological. It's hard to say that the Ayatollah Khomeini still has a Twitter account, or Vladimir Putin still has a Twitter account, but not Trump, that there isn't some kind of direct ideological filtering by Twitter. Now, that would be perfectly okay. They're a private company. I have no problem with Twitter having that partisan attitude. They have a right to have a partisan attitude.
Yes. Sorry, I need. We're running out of time, and we still have super chats to get to. But my point bringing up Trump is that, like, he framed him and especially the pundits who like him or support the Republican Party, they framed it so that people who hate Trump and criticize him and do what they can to silence Trump are the left. So you mentioned they banned Trump. I don't think banning Trump after January 6th is necessarily a partisan act. A lot of people really wanted Trump off social media, including, I would posit, Republicans, believe it or not, or people who had voted for Trump. So it's not a partisan or ideological thing. It's this man is
not
causing
a partisan issue, but it's clearly a partisan issue.
But why is it partisan if Trump the individual has caused chaos and people want him off social media?
That's what I mean. I think what Trump did on January 6th was utterly pernicious. You know my opinion on that. He should have conceded December weeks earlier, much less encourage people to come out on January 6th. I think it was awful what Trump did. However, he has supporters. And I don't care what, free speech means free speech. So but Twitter is a private company, has every right to filter out that. It's not censorship, that speech. If they're doing it, however, in any way as a result of or as a product of government threats or government favors, now we have a problem, in my view.
Okay. Okay. Look, I mean, we can keep on going for many hours on these topics. I mean, it's fascinating stuff. My sort of ultimate thesis when it comes to this is people are too quick to put their finger on what's going on at a company like Twitter or Facebook. My view is it's complex. It needs to be complex in order to exist for there to be a website or an app where virtually anyone has access to it. It's always going to be complex. And yes, it's always going to have a sort of philosophical or partisan backdrop. But at the same time, even that's hard to entirely understand, much less to accuse and to find, to incriminate. So it's always going to be very complicated. And that's kind of like my ultimate thing.
It will always be complicated until and unless the government gets out of the business of regulating all media companies, period, end of report. And how about all private companies, end of report?
Yes,
with antitrust
that
laws?
we agree. But I'm saying still it would be like virtually impossible to have Twitter be, quote, nonpartisan. They're always going to be on some level.
Agreed.
So even in a free market, I think we'd be dealing with the same sort of situation. And I would still be telling the public, I'd be telling people, we need to relax. Yes, Elon Musk bought Twitter, but everyone needs to take a cold shower because you're way too excited thinking that this is, the end of your problems.
It's not the end of anyone's problem, but the fact that Elon Musk can buy Twitter and impose now a new policy is the solution. Insofar as we have freedom, the freedom to have competing social media outlets with different perspectives is the answer. The answer to the problem is to have private competing media platforms with different editorial policies. In fact, we need to open that up so that everyone, can have their own media platforms, but the media and acknowledge that the media platforms are curating, are filtering. And so long as there's no indication that that filtering is happening as a result of government threats or favors, I have no problem with it. None whatever.
And I'm saying we don't even know the new policies. Elon Musk doesn't know his own policies. Right. Twitter is always going to be pissing off a bunch of people and making a handful of people happy. So there's really no way around that. Even under capitalism, even take out the government gun, we're always going to have accusations that social media is acting on behalf of one candidate or another. because
And if the government
that's
doesn't have
what's.
the power to threaten or give favors, then there'd be no issue. Okay,
But it
be
would still
biased.
look
Be
like it. It
secretly
would you,
biased.
but you could still even under laissez-faire capitalism, someone might be able to accuse Twitter of being a fraudulent organization who says we are a marketplace of
Well,
ideas,
if they
but then
do
you
lie
could say,
about
oh
their
look, they
product,
did something that benefits one side. Go ahead.
well, then just like any other seller of any product, if they're lying about their product to get customers to buy it, it's simple commercial fraud.
But as you can see today, what you consider to be Twitter being fraudulent, to me, I'm saying no. It's much more nuanced than that, given what's possible and what Twitter is by nature, and how much we don't know and don't understand. So to me, Jack Dorsey telling Congress we don't shadow ban conservatives, to me, that's I don't see that as a lie. To me, it's like he's like, that's not our official policy. We don't go out and try to shadow ban conservatives. But at the same time, if someone like Charlie Kirk or Donald Trump are rabble rousing, especially during a time of crisis, and
Right.
Twitter is following the CDC's advice, that to me is not shadow banning conservatives.
I had friends disappeared from Twitter long before January 6th for their political views. I had friends who were disappeared from Twitter long before January 6th.
Yes, a lot. We all do. Almost nobody's been more reprimanded
Jack Dorsey
or
going
used.
to Congress and saying we didn't have ideological filters, in effect.
I don't see again. You can't easily make the case that these are ideological. It's you posted something provocative. A lot of times, somebody somewhere inside of Twitter made a decision, or even it was an algorithmic move. That's another aspect of this we didn't really cover.
If we have internal messages, we don't want Trump to get elected is the reason. Would that convince you?
I mean, it would convince me that in that particular case, Twitter's move on vis-a-vis the Hunter Biden laptop was clearly a Democrat thing.
Do you seriously have any doubt that Twitter was in favor of Biden winning? And again, if it was truly private, I have no problem with that. The question is the lie, though.
Look, we know most educated, technologically savvy, employed people tend to vote Democrat. And the fact that Republicans don't believe in evolution and want gay marriage to be overturned maybe has something to do with that. But to me, that does, like, we're never going to get around that. That's always going to be sort of looming. So
what if Jack Dorsey says, no, but I'm not banning people just simply because they disagree with me about abortion, even if it's a pernicious issue, even if I agree with Twitter? That's irrelevant to this question.
Okay, we're truly out of time.
Okay,
be continued. I'm sure this Twitter will not go away as a topic.
No,
Let me run through the super chats. Marilyn says a pox on all their houses. Yes, Marilyn again says fraud. Okay, she says fraud, but no one has to follow Twitter. You can't balance government favors. Also, don't let the left have the term liberal. On that, we agree. The word liberal, I'm happy to say, by the way, as the left themselves, like leftists have turned on liberalism. And of course, the right, they used to say, oh, the left, liberalism is our thing. We're the classical
we're
liberals.
the liberals. If the word has any
right, yes,
we're
that's
the
what I'm saying.
liberals.
So, as conservatives have been distancing themselves from classical liberalism, and of course the left they're no longer interested in that term. So it's really up to people like you and me.
I say we take it back. It's ours.
And I think that is happening. I think we're seeing reasonable people and general advocates of liberty take the word liberal back, and it's sort of happening.
Mary said there that's important. The mere fact that I have a choice not to buy the product does not cure private commercial fraud. If I go into a store, Walmart, and I buy a toaster, and they say this toaster has certain qualities to it, and and the mere fact that I could avoid buying the toaster, and I buy the toaster under the idea that it will do what it fraudulently claims it can do, and it doesn't do it, that's still commercial fraud. The fact that I can walk away from the purchase doesn't mean that those who did purchase it under that lie weren't victims of fraud.
Something to explore in greater depth next time. Marilyn says, why are they even testifying? That's a great question.
There we have the deeper question. But the justification for that, they're focused totally on the wrong thing. The Republicans want to enforce antitrust laws, for example. All of that questioning is illegitimate from the Republicans, as far as I'm concerned. Insofar as they would call them before them and ask, was it because of the pressures from government? Was it when you were doing the bidding of either Trump or Biden in suppressing something? Why were you doing that? And can we explore whether or not your civil immunity had something to do with that, whether these threats of antitrust had something to do with that, et cetera, et cetera? That's a valid thing for government to Congress to investigate, so they can repeal all this damn stuff that gives them threats and favors to certain businesses.
We need to keep going. Micah with $5 says, put these hypocrites in a state of aporia. Does that mean like disarray and confusion, or what?
I'm not sure what it means.
I read the word in the context of post-structuralism and postmodernism, like aporia. So I think it means an undesirable state. Free Trade with 200 Swedish krones says, thanks for these streams, gentlemen. The objectivist community is an island of rational ideas in an ocean of tribalism and mysticism. Yes and no. I tend to say be prudent, even by being, pro the objectivist community. Be prudent, be open-minded, take a look at the evidence. There are, in my views,
not everyone who calls themselves an objectivist is anything like an objectivist. So you still buyer beware out there. But you're right. And this community, yeah, I agree with you. We engage in rational discussions. Thank you.
Yeah, and still there's differences of interpretation and of understanding. So it's very difficult to get things right. But also, take a look at the world outside. There are a lot of reasonable people. They're not 100% reasonable, but they're in many ways they're good guys in my view. So let's not be
at least in this conversation. You absolutely can have a reasonable difference of opinion here, but at least in this conversation, we're identifying the issues.
Yeah. Jonathan Honig with 2.9. Thank you, Jonathan Honig. And thank you, Marilyn. She says, Twitter has the right to make choices I don't like. Yes, they do. Marilyn again says, get rid of the immunity. Seriously? No. All right. And Christopher Smith with 149 Canadian. Thank you for that. Those are all the super chats. And since we don't have the time to debate further if Twitter should lose their immunity, we'll just say Marilyn is correct because I agree with her. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, James. Always a great time. Coming up now in like a moment, as soon as we're done here, is Finance Friday with Jim Brown, and then at 10 p.m. UK time, it's TV Talk on Enola Holmes with Mark Pellegrino, Jacqueline Schumann, and Jennifer Buani. You're going to want to watch this episode. That I can promise you, and you'll see what I mean. Thank you all. And goodbye.
Thanks, Rekha.